to the twilight of the gods, as it were, for the Rock Island. All right, Greg, are you about ready to roll?
I am ready.
Okay. For those who had not are joining us late, this is Greg Schneider from Emporia State University. Greg, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'm really happy to be here. I've read Roger's works. I think I have a whole bookshelf just dedicated to Roger's works, and Roger was very helpful to me on this book, which is now about 8 years old, though the paperback came out last year from University of Kansas Press, and which I got interested because, well, I'll talk about that in a second, but I got interested because I always wanted to do a book on the Rock Island going back to high school when I first got interested in the railroad growing up in Chicago. Let me talk a little bit about the kind of conventional wisdom, and a lot of this is true, no doubt. Conventional wisdom is truth on a lot of these levels. But in terms of some of the arguments that I make and some of the wider concerns I make in the book, it's not just about railroad history, it's about a wider kind of set of problems that is facing industry in the late 20th century, particularly government, the mixed economy, and the nature of capitalism, which is creative destruction, according to Joseph Schumpeter. So I kind of take, if Roger didn't like economics that much, I kind of do. So that's where a lot of my book focuses on, but not so much that you get lost in economic history. But the conventional wisdom, of course, is that the Rock Island declined because of, and collapsed because of incompetent management that allowed the railroad to decline. And certainly there's truth in that. And we'll talk a little bit about that today, and certainly in the questions, I'm sure. That Rock Island bondholders, as well as stockholders, particularly Henry Crown, who was the largest bondholder and stockholder for the railroad for decades, all the way till the end, refused to reinvest in the property. Once merger was underway with UP, and there's truth to that as well. In some respects, why should you invest if you're going to merge with a far richer railroad? But also by the 1970s, when it was clear that the railroad had decayed so much and rates of return on railroad investment weren't high, why invest in a railroad that doesn't look like it's possibly to survive? So Crown was realistic in his assessment of not putting a lot of money into it. He was investing rather in Burlington Northern and Frisco stock a lot during the 1970s, from what I learned later. Rock Island looked to Union Pacific and the SP, the Southern Pacific, to save the property, and accordingly didn't have the means, and I'll show you why, but could not invest heavily in the property itself without the help of those two railroads. And the UP was a little stingy when it came to aiding the Rock Island during the late 60s and early 70s. The Interstate Commerce Commission, taking 10 years to adjudicate the case, the longest case in the ICC's history, killed the railroad. That's certainly one of my central contentions in the book, and certainly provable and no doubt from what the Tenich report does to the wider system of the railroads in the West. Judge Frank McGarr, who was the liquidation judge, the federal court judge in the Northern Illinois District in Chicago, killed the railroad in 1980 by his decision to liquidate the property. This I think is suggested by numerous fans of the Rock Island, because so much of the property, as I say below that, has been saved. In other words, about 5,000 miles of the system is still in use. But all liquidation does is end the company. There is no way the Rock Island railroad could survive as an operating company, even if the railroad assets are worth a lot in liquidation, which it turned out to be the case, because the Rock Island is about 300 to 400 million in the hole in 1980 when it's liquidated, and winds up as a new company, Chicago Pacific, with 300 million primarily in cash after selling assets of the railroad, track, equipment, and other things. And while 5,000 of the 7,000 miles of the system were still in use, the Rock Island itself could not survive as a corporation or as an operating railroad. Labor unions helped kill the Rock Island. The strike in 1979 was the death knell of the railroad. I would make this argument a little differently today than I did then. But certainly what I think Fred Kroll, who was the head of the BRAC union that struck the Rock Island in August of 1979, may have been interested in getting, certainly, was a federal bailout. And what nobody really kind of understood then is why there was no Midwestern Conrail, for instance, with the bankruptcies of the Milwaukee Road, the Rock Island, as well as other railroads. And it was quite clear from digging through the Ford and Carter papers why there was not one, to looking at the presidential level and some of the arguments made at those levels about helping out and bailing out another other railroad properties in the country. So those are the kind of conventional things, and we'll kind of talk about all of these as we go along, certainly, but certainly I will favor questions too about some of these concerns as we move ahead as well. So my bigger argument in the book is, in some respects, the Rock Island story is part of the bigger story of what the railroad problem is. And the railroad problem, pretty ill-defined, even in a book with the title by a great political economist by the name of Leo Scharfman, who never really defines the railroad problem. I tried to in the new book I'm working on, but I can't give you the definition offhand because it's too cumbersome. So I can't remember it myself without reading it. But the railroad problem had been around for at least a century by the time the Rock Island is liquidated, and certainly impacted heavily by government regulation, which impacted what management could or could not do regarding issues like wage rates, rates for service, abandonments of service, et cetera, after the 1920 Transportation Act especially, which strengthened the ICC's hand in that. And while in the late 1950s, many railroads throughout the country, even prosperous ones, or at least on the surface prosperous ones, are searching for mergers as an opportunity to kind of consolidate service, to solve what was called the strong road, weak road problem, which went back to the early part of the 20th century. And the merger between the Rock Island and the Union Pacific was, of course, perfect in this regard, because the Union Pacific was a strong road, the Rock Island a weak road. And so this would have been a perfect merger, consolidating these properties, if not for the fact that it would have hurt other properties in the Midwest and the Western states, especially the Chicago Northwestern, which we'll turn to here in a bit. So the wider railroad problem and the impact of regulation was a serious issue throughout the 20th century. How can railroads make money in a highly regulated environment? How can they manage services and rates? Some railroads could do this deftly because of the territory they ran in. Other railroads were hurt by the fact that they ran through heavily agricultural territory, which was subject to the vagaries of commodity prices, bad weather, all sorts of other things. And adding to this, of course, in the post-war period, the changed transportation economy that develops government sponsorship of the interstate highway system, which of course is built right alongside the railroads, because they have the best routes, just as the railroads had built initially alongside bigger canals in the 19th century. But the government sponsorship of barge lines, airlines, of course, railroads were still paying federal, state, and local taxes on property, on buildings and other things, whereas airlines had government subsidized airports, and this was a disadvantage to the railroads. So in other words, part of the wider story is this sense of government interference and government intervention in the system, as well as the problems that railroads had been having, overbuilt as they were in the early 20th century. There were going to be survivors and there were going to be losers in the whole process of ironing this out. As sad as this is to say, for somebody like myself, and I'm sure many of you, all of you on this call, on this program, who are Rock Island fans. So in trying to get a sense of this, the best way to do this is from an Austrian economist by the name of Joseph Schumpeter, who popularized a term that actually comes from Marx and Marxism about the changes in capitalism. Marx would have preferred changes in capitalism that came through revolution and revolutionary change. But Schumpeter takes this term, which is called creative destruction, and says, as I have the quotes here, capitalism is by nature a form or method of economic change, and not only never is, but never can be stationary. And the process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. It is what capitalism consists in and what every capitalist concern has got to live in. So if you have a perfect capitalist system, as in most cases exist in America throughout its history, the problem of winners and losers entered in. It's very social Darwinistic. Add to it the mixed economy of the post-war period, and you have the recipe for the kind of creative destruction that you saw in the railroad industry, certainly by the 1970s. It could work within the capitalist system itself or within industries within the capitalist system as well. And so Schumpeter was a big part of my thinking. I quote him once. I didn't want to belabor the book with too much economic history. So for me, kind of my background is interesting in this frame because much like Roger, well, not like Roger, I guess, I went to school in Iowa. I wasn't from Iowa. I'm actually from a Chicago suburb, Brookfield, along the Burlington, Northern, CB&Q before that, of course. And by the time I was 15, the Rock Island was in its death throes, and I became kind of obsessed with the Rock Island, reading about it in Train magazine and loving the fact that it had those very colorful locomotives and very interesting locomotives. But I didn't drive yet. I couldn't get down to Blue Island. I couldn't take any pictures of the Rock Island. It didn't come through my area. And by the time I did, most of the locomotives all the locomotives were gone from Blue Island. So I got some great pictures from 1982 of Blue Island Yard and some of the cabooses and other Rock Island cars that were still there. And in high school, I wrote a paper about the Rock Island, a general history of it, and always had this in the back of my mind if I wound up getting a doctorate in history. But what I first focused on in my historical work was the history of conservatism. I went to Drake University in Iowa, so down the road from where Roger went to school, and always took photos of Rock Island stations and other things along the way, back and forth between Chicago and Iowa, but of course never rode the Rock Island since it no longer existed. So what I framed the book as is what my interests were coming out of doing the history of conservatism, about free market ideas, about economic policy making, about the history of the presidency and other things in shaping economic policy, what I call a policy history. So while it's a history of a railroad, it's much more of a framework of the history of the railroad from the perspective of government and from the perspective of wider parts of the story of industry and capitalism in the late 20th century. And I know that sometimes disappointed readers of it who would have liked to see more, and probably should have, from my perspective now, of divisions and other things that reflects railroad history. But I framed the book this way because I thought it was a bigger story. It was telling a bigger story about the government's interaction in business. The nice thing about the Rock Island, to do research on it, is that there are plenty of sources. So I visited, I think, 14 separate archives. And of course, the Rock Island's own papers, I found after the book was published. A lawyer from Chicago contacted me, and I do not remember his name, unfortunately. It was many years ago now, but he told me that he was the one who actually saved the Rock Island's papers, as the trustee was going to discard them. And after finding out about this, he said, you would have a weekend to get the papers boxed up and out of the warehouse that was, I think, going to be torn down near LaSalle Street. And he did, and luckily got them deposited at the University of Oklahoma Western History Collection, as well as a slew of them at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. And those papers are really crucial, especially for the later part of the Rock Island's history. For the earlier part, not much is there, but for the later part from the post-World War II era on, it's a treasure trove of the Rock Island story, as well as the liquidation, as well as some of the court case from the Rock Island's perspective, as well as the merger papers and materials are all there as well. So it's a great resource. Presidential libraries were very important to me as well as other archives throughout the country. So much of this was framed in the sense that I do very contemporary history. And so the Rock Island was very much part of this contemporary history story that I like to tell. What I didn't do and what I decided not to do, and maybe that's a mistake in retrospect, is to interview some key people. I did do an interview with Theodore Desch a couple of years before he passed away, the last surviving president of the Rock Island. It wasn't incredibly helpful to me, but I did get a sense of some of the problems he was facing during his tenure. And part of the reason for kind of avoiding interviews with people is because I wanted to have my own perspective going in. My first book was on a conservative student group in the 1960s called Young Americans for Freedom. And I did about 30 or 40 oral interviews with the YAF members, who, of course, many of whom were all alive at the time I started this in the 1990s, and who played a role in conservative politics over the years. And sometimes I thought the interviews were nice for helpful guidance through the process of doing the research, but colorful stories, but not exactly the story I wanted to tell. So I was stubborn and avoided doing a lot of interviews with that, which I might change if I had to do it all over again. So this is the map of the Rock Island in the 70s, maybe. I think they're not even in Sioux Falls by then, but it could be. But this is the kind of the map that the Rock Island was running. Roger had talked so well about that. And what I tell in the book is the main story of the Rock Island as a Granger railroad with declining little industry on line, declining revenues, certainly by the late 1950s, that needed a merger with a strong road in order to survive. And I kind of tell that story in some detail, how Henry Crown in particular, who was the kind of the head of the executive committee of the board of directors, initially wanted a merger with the Milwaukee Road, and that went to the point where it was actually studied, and money was spent to study the prospects of merger, and then pulled after a year of that. And then he had Downing Jenks, the president, approach the Missouri Pacific, and it turned out that the Missouri Pacific favored Downing Jenks more than Crown did, and so let him escape to head up MOPAC, which was seen as a great loss. And then the Rock Island had problems finally finding the Union Pacific, which wanted entry into Chicago as well. We kind of forget this, as well as St. Louis. As was mentioned earlier, that would have been kind of an instrumental line if it could have been rebuilt with UP money. Maybe, maybe not, but this is something that was part of what the UP's original goal was. So I talk in detail about the merger story in the book. I'll talk less about that, but certainly mention key things about it. The federal government took forever to decide the merger, as is well known. The first merger filing occurs officially in 1963. The Chicago Northwestern intervenes against it immediately, and Ben Heineman, the Chicago Northwestern president, who I admire for his skillfulness in defending his railroad in the book, so he might be a villain of the story to many Rock Island fans, but he's skillful at kind of being an impetus to the merger, kind of getting in the way to help prevent a merger that would kill his railroad, as the UP and Chicago Northwestern exchange something between 150,000 to 200,000 cars a year at Fremont, Nebraska. So that's a lifeline for the CNW. And he intervenes, as well as eventually 12 other railroads intervene in the case. But when the ICC examiner, there's hearings on the case that are held for a year, about 275 days of hearings, producing 40,000 pages of testimony and over 200,000 pages of evidence. Now, if you consider the Penn Central merger, which is a total disaster and also informs my work, certainly in the book, produced about 25,000 pages of testimony and about 120,000 pages of evidence. I mean, the Rock Island Union Pacific story really inflames the Western railroads. And so it takes the ICC examiner, Nathan Klatinich, about 4 or 5 years. He's ill at one point, so he's out of commission for about a year to produce a 3-volume report, which would fundamentally transform the Western Railroad map, at which time the Rock Island decays as a property, waiting for the kind of merger bailout, which finally is approved, but approved so late it doesn't matter. And then bankruptcy in 75, and then liquidation in 1980. Of course, the largest liquidation of a railroad in US history. So when I tell the story, I divide it to Requiem. So I divide it into 3 acts. The first one is the merger story. And the Rock Island comes out of a bankruptcy after 15 years, put in its second bankruptcy by the Great Depression, which Roger mentioned in his talk earlier. But it had been rebuilt. It was in pretty good physical shape. It had streamliners like the rockets, as Steve had shown in his slides of Bureau. It was dieselized by 1954. A lot of the curvature was replaced on the railroad. The Atlantic Iowa rebuild of the main line was crucial to this. And it was headed up by John Dow Farrington, who was a good railroad man, a bit conservative maybe, certainly akin to Downing Jenks and his vision of railroad building. And Jenks would replace Farrington in the late 50s and be head of the Rock Island until 1960 when he goes to MOPAC. And revenues were pretty good. In 1949, about $197 million, which was the highest, I think, in the company's history to that time, with a pretty low operating expense ratio. So after coming out of bankruptcy, reorganized, rebuilt, led by Farrington, the road of planned progress, as he calls it, the Rock Island seems to be in pretty good shape. And there's Farrington with several members of the board. Kind of looks like an FDR kind of a look-alike in the center. Harry Darby's to his left, and Darby would be later a senator from Kansas. His papers, I guess, are at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas, but unorganized. So they have not yet, if they will ever be, put into the ability to use. And that was the last time I checked on that. It was about 8 years ago. So that might contain some Rock Island records from the board, but were unavailable to me. A decade later, by 1959, the railroads, as you probably know, were suffering from the competition from trucking. The interstate highways had hurt passenger trains, especially. Airlines had hurt passenger trains as well. Continued regulation by the ICC and continued constraints on passenger service coming out of World War II, for instance, was hurting the railroads, as well as low capital investment overall in the railroad industry. In the industry itself, during the 1950s, the rate of return on equity was about 4%. By the 70s, it was 2%. So why would you invest in railroads when you could return greater equity as an investor in new companies with greater growth potential and greater rates of return? So the railroad industry was having a lot of trouble attracting private capital, with a few exceptions here and there, but still overall, the rate of return was pretty low. Now, by 1959, the Rock Island was still profitable. Revenues hit its peak, $219 million, expenses of about $172 million, a net income of about 8. So that's not great, but it's still a profit for a railroad that's heavily dependent, as we know, on agricultural commodities, with facing increasing wages, little industry online, regulation, and beginning due to the 1958 recession, which needs to get more written about because it was a pretty severe recession. It was the worst recession since the Great Depression in 1958, and one that hit especially the upper Midwest and industrial economy fairly hard. The Rock Island begins to cut its maintenance of its track. And Downing Jenks, due to lack of funds to pay for maintenance, for instance, cuts expenses on cross ties, as well as new ballast and the like. So they had cross ties on mainline track went from about 460,000 in 1957 to 246,000 in 1958, and they never recovered. So the average amount that the Rock Island was putting on cross ties was pretty strong in the post-war era, and the Rock Island never recovers that 400,000 after 1958. It also replaced only in 1958 about 5,600 tons of rail, and was averaging about 20,000 tons of rail in its post-World War II era. That also is difficult for the Rock Island to replace after 1958. So the 1958 recession, I think, is a huge turning point for the railroad in a way, certainly instrumental to getting Crown and others looking to merge. That's the beginnings kind of the merger, the modern merger era to a degree. And for the Rock Island, like I said, the board approves and seeks and does studies to begin a merger with the Milwaukee Road, but was rejected in the end by the board after a study was prepared and presented to the board, was rejected by the board of directors, with Crown, I think, playing the major role, partially because Crown wanted personally a merger, if possible, with the Chicago Northwestern. And what's interesting about that is during the merger discussions with the Union Pacific in the mid-60s, there's a proposal for the Rock Island, and it's by Heinemann, the Rock Island, the Milwaukee Road, and the Chicago Northwestern, newly merged, I believe, with the Chicago Great Western, to merge together and to create a kind of Midwestern railroad. But Crown and the board rejects that because not only are they in talks with the UP, but they consider all three railroads kind of basket cases, which would lead to bankruptcy, which would have been, probable maybe, but it would have been interesting to see where that would have gone as a counterfactual. But it's rejected. The initial merger study is rejected in 1960 or 60, when, like I said, when Downing-Jenks is sent by Crown to explore a merger with the MOPAC. I don't think really seriously. The MOPAC instead lures Jenks away, and Crown and Jenks did not get along. I don't know the reasons why that was the case, but Crown may have preferred to have Heinemann as president of the Rock Island. Later, he prefers somebody like Al Pearlman as president of the Rock Island, but he can't get the board to go along with that. In some respects, the relationship's bad between the two men, and Jenks leaves to brighter pastures. Now, the MOPAC had just been reorganized after a 25-year bankruptcy, and had certainly more industry, more resources in its territory, better territory than the Rock Island does, and he becomes a successful executive, eventually merging it into the UP. So by 1962, 63, the Rock Island and the Union Pacific begin to explore a merger. And fearing that the Union Pacific would merge with the Rock Island, the Southern Pacific joins with the intention of buying the southern part of the Rock Island and taking that through a merger. And all three roads enter into this discussion of a merger in 1963, file the necessary paperwork with the ICC. The stock, how it would have worked was the stock buyout would have come from the UP, and the southern lines would have been sold to the Southern Pacific. So this is the Union Pacific in the 60s. Here's the Southern Pacific, of course, in the 60s, with its linkage with the Rock Island at Tucumcari. And then a map of the systems as proposed. So the Rock Island, the Southern Pacific would have taken, through its Cotton Belt subsidiary, which winds up operating it after liquidation, the Choctaw route, the southern part of the spine line from Harrington to Fort Worth, as well as the Golden State route from Kansas City forward. The Union Pacific would have taken the northern half of the property, including the Iowa lines, the Chicago line, as well as the St. Louis line. So we forget the St. Louis line, but that was part of the attraction for the Union Pacific. Now, when the merger starts, I mean, the Union Pacific knows it's going to have to spend quite a bit of money to rehabilitate the property. So even though the Rock Island's still running premier passenger trains, even though it's still producing some revenue through at least 1964, it's in the black, in other words. The estimate is anywhere from $100 to $200 million will have to be spent to bring up the system to the standards of the Union Pacific. So knowing this, the Rock Island shareholders don't get a favorable, initially don't get a favorable stock ratio to merge, but Crown knows that the property needs to survive. And so if his investments in bonds are to do well, the merger would have to go through. So the board approves it. And the intervention begins immediately from Ben Heineman, who's the first to kind of intervene in the case. And first he tries to offer a separate stock swap, which I talk about in detail, maybe too much detail, but it's in there. It's in the book, and I won't belabor that now. But he offers basically Rock Island stockholders, in his mind, a better deal, except it wasn't. But it's adjudicated in a Chicago courtroom. The irony is it's the same judge who decides, Julius Hoffman, who would later become infamous for his Chicago 7 trial of the anti-war protesters at the Chicago Democrat Convention. And it winds up actually in the UP and Rock Island's favor. But because of that intervention by Heineman, the stock offer is a little sweeter. The UP has to adjust it to make sure that the CNW's attempt to do this, it's almost like a hostile takeover in a way, doesn't succeed. So when the case is finally filed in the ICC, like I said, the intervention comes from the CNW, and he's joined by initially 5 railroads who opposed the merger, and then 7 others by 1968. Why? Because of the potential for redrawing the entire railroad map, the potential to lose division points and gateways and car exchanges that I didn't go into in a lot of detail in the book. And that's certainly a weakness that I would change now. All authors have regrets, and that's one of them. So in essence, showing that would have helped immensely to show why the railroads intervened. But Heineman's the leader of this initially, is the one who plays the largest role in kind of intervening against the Rock Island Union Pacific merger, which would kill his railroad. And he was very sure to make sure that the CNW survived. Like I said, the Kletenich report by ICC rail examiner Nathan Kletenich is written after the testimony's finished in 1968. It's released in 3 volumes, the first summary volume in 1971, and then he's ill for a year, and then 2 other volumes, which are mostly about the kind of changes in the railroad map that come about, with the final one released in 1974. The final one recommends merger. There had been a syllabus shorter syllabus issued first that recommends merger, but with such vast conditions in the remaking of the railroad map of the West that it was sure to invite challenges and probably wind up, in courts or wind up back at the ICC for another decade. So it was basically impossible for that merger to go through after about a 10-year delay from 1973 to 1974. So there's the Chicago Northwestern map. So doesn't show it, but Fremont near Omaha, of course, is the main exchange point for the Chicago Northwestern and the UP. Like I said, most of the freight, this is another problem with the Rock Island UP merger, most of the freight heading eastbound toward Chicago goes over the CNW anyways, with the Rock Island getting, I think it's less than 15% of all the freight exchanged with the UP, if I remember correctly, and other railroads getting a share too. So in some respects, the natural partner, as it turns out to be, the natural partner for the Union Pacific is the Chicago Northwestern. When Ben Heineman forms Northwest Industries and the railroad is sold to the employees and Larry Provost president, he and John Kennefick, the UP president, after the Union Pacific Corporation is formed, kind of pursue a relationship that leads to basically the UP handling most of its freight over the Chicago Northwestern. This is actually even before the merger's consummated, as it turns out. So again, I call him a one-man wrecking crew, but I admire him immensely for at least defending his property, which is what Ben Heineman's strategy is to do. And like I said, he wants to ruin the merger initially by offering a stock swap that's more attractive to the UP. And he winds up in an odd way helping Rock Island shareholders get a better term after the court throws it out, which was not his intention, surely. He keeps saying over and over again, once the Rock Island UP merger's in the ICC's hands, he keeps talking about how it would ruin and alter the regional rail map of the West. He proposes, I call it the merge à trois between the Rock Island, Chicago Northwestern, and Milwaukee Road. That doesn't come about. He's not really probably interested in it actually coming about. He's interested in delaying it. And one railroad would survive and it would be his. And certainly that winds up happening, as we know what happens with the Rock Island as well as the Milwaukee Road. And Larry Provo continues the job once he's head of the Chicago and Northwestern. Now, Heinemann was still alive when I did the book, but he was up there in age, and I was told that he did not have the ability to remember a lot of this detail, so I did not interview him. This is where Barriger comes in, so I have to mention Barriger, right? Of course. And the story of Barriger and the Rock Island, as Nick said, he's a vice president in the 50s. He writes his book, Super Railroads. I think during the time he's vice president of Rock Island, or soon after, as Roger has revealed in his book on his biography of Barriger. And in the early 70s, well, mid 70s, right before his death in 1976, he's kind of back as traveling freight agent for the Rock Island, only for a few months before he dies. And Barriger had called the presidents of the Rock Island after Farrington's death in 1961, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's R. Ellis Johnson, who sometimes is called a good railroad man and sometimes called a railroader who likes to cuss a lot. I kind of like that. He seems curmudgeonly. Then you have Jervis Langdon, brought in from the B&O, who is very effective, brought in especially by Crown because he hopes that Langdon can get the merger through, but Langdon cannot do it and finds, again, the problems of running the railroad in a merger agreement that doesn't have the capital to invest, a problem. And he leaves for the Penn Central as a trustee in 1970 after he reaches the mandatory retirement age then of 65. Another story that Roger tells very well. Then you have William Dixon, one of Langdon's kind of proteges at the B&O, and then Ted Desch, who grew up on the Rock Island and is the last president before John W. Ingram. Once the federal government starts to bail out the Penn Central and other eastern roads, and once the Nixon administration helps create Amtrak, and you get the 3R Act passed, and then the 4R Act later to create Conrail, the Rock Island tries to secure funds from the federal government as well. One of the amount they want in 1974 is a $100 million loan from the federal government. And the head of the FRA at the time, the Federal Railroad Administration, this newly created agency appointed by Nixon, was John W. Ingram. And John Barriger is working for Ingram at the time at the FRA. And according to a source in the Rock Island papers by their counsel, Houston Harsha, who was a lawyer with the firm Kirkland and Ellis, it's a long memo about the effort that Barriger makes, in essence, to try to get Ingram hired as the Rock Island's president in 1974. There's no real quid pro quo mentioned in this document or in the New York Times article that kind of confirms it. And I talk about this in the book, but certainly Barriger is involved in talking to key people about getting Ingram onto the Rock Island presidency, maybe with the realization then that the FRA will provide the loan. But Ingram was so hated by the FRA people, as well as by others in the railroad industry, that there's no chance in hell that Ingram will get the loan from the FRA as Rock Island president. He is made president at a board meeting in October of 1974. Henry Crown was ill for the last year of really the Rock Island's life, so he's not there when Ingram's made president. But 3 new board members from New York play a crucial role in this, and Ingram is hired in October of 74, and Dixon and Desch are sent packing. But what the big problems were is that the maintenance problem continued, waiting for merger. They were still paying dividends on stock until 1963, and none of the board members were investing into the property, which is a sign that they don't have confidence that the property will exist in the future. I couldn't find pictures of Desch or Dixon, but this is R.E. Ellis on the left, of course, Jervis Langdon on the upper right, and then Barriger on the bottom right, though an older picture, not from the 70s. That's from the Barriger Library. So the impact of this, as I show in the book, this is what we're facing overall. The last profitable year of the Rock Island was $3.8 million in 1964, and then huge losses following, especially 1967 through 70. So even though Jervis Langdon improves the property drastically, commuter cars, new locomotives, new investments and the like, the subject problems of the agricultural economy, bad weather, crop failures, and other things play a role in the decreasing monetary revenues for the Rock Island. The Union Pacific, which is involved in not only the merger discussions, but also in transforming itself into a corporation, diversifying as many powerful companies did in the railroad industry, including disastrously Penn Central, who could not pull it off very effectively due to corruption in the diversification, do not aid the Rock Island. So Crown and other board members consistently ask the Union Pacific for assistance and equipment and other things, and they get some. Old E9s, for instance, which are painted yellow with the Rock Island Herald, as well as other kind of lease arrangements that the UP provides, but really nothing to fix up the property and the track. And as you can see from those losses, they pile up. And in 1974, pile up drastically. 23 million is lost that year, and so on, with daily checks on the till going on in Rock Island's headquarters. On March 17th of 1975, the Rock Island files for bankruptcy after the FRA says, we'll give you a loan of $9 million rather than 100. So that's a big slap in the face to Ingram, who could not secure anything more than $9 million, which, as Ingram says, won't get us through the end of March. And certainly by March, by St. Patrick's Day, the Rock Island files for bankruptcy. It's third and last. And under bankruptcy court protection, the railroad would lose an additional $100 million over the next 5 years. There's its working capital position, which is in the red by 1967. So hemorrhaging money consistently and constantly throughout the 10-year period there. The bankruptcy tale, I did rely heavily on the bankruptcy court proceedings. So a lot of quotations from the trustee, the judge, who I find very honest broker, and he was very impeccable kind of character in the bankruptcy proceedings. But the Rock Island files for bankruptcy on March 17th. The Ford administration refuses to bail it out. So I have a notes that I found in the Ford Library, which is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the University of Michigan campus, and then his presidential museums in Grand Rapids, where he's from. But in the Ford Library, I found handwritten notes from one of Ford's staffers who had called Henry Crown and basically wrote on the piece of paper, no bailout for Rock Island, liquidate the property. So Crown's position from immediately was to get his money out of the property, not to encourage it to continue to go on. So there's no discussion of a bailout for the Rock Island in the Ford administration in 1975. Meanwhile, of course, the government had helped bail out Penn Central and other Northeastern bankrupts. Again, territory matters. Those railroads travel where the Washington and New York and the major city, Philadelphia, and the major cities and industries of the Northeast, and that plays a role certainly in them getting money, but the Midwestern railroads not getting money as well. I call it in the book, writing it during the time of the housing crisis in 2008, 2009, too big to fail. The Penn Central's too big to fail. The Rock Island's too small to succeed in the end. Judge McGarr, though, does pursue reorganization. He appoints his former law partner, William Gibbons, as trustee. Gibbons has no idea how to run a railroad, so he keeps Ingram on for a couple of years, and they work to try to reorganize the property. The government doesn't really get money to help, and the intervention by Crown, pictured here, plays a decisive role. Crown's a true rags to riches tale, so he's admirable in a lot of ways. His parents came from the pale of settlement in Russia, Jewish family. His father was a peddler. His brothers established the Material Services Corporation, which was an aggregate business, and later one of the largest construction companies. Certainly ties to politicians helped this, the largest in the Midwest. And I did not know about the red color of the paint. That's interesting. I learned something every day. He's a pretty smart investor in railroads. He buys Rock Island stock bonds in 1948, right before it comes out of bankruptcy, and then he cashes those in for stock. And so he's the largest owner throughout the post-war period of Rock Island stock as well as bonds on the railroad property. So of course he has an interest as a bondholder to get his money out in bankruptcy because they would be paid first. And he serves on the board from 48 to 75, heading up the finance and executive committees. Like I said, he fights the Rock Island's trustee in court. He retains the Chicago law firm of Jenner and Block, who would also be involved in the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy a few years later. In fact, Dan Murray, who I interviewed for and helped me with the bankruptcy issues of the book, was involved in the case. Other banks in Chicago were also part of this as well. And after liquidation, of course, because he wants to assure that his bonds get paid, Jenner and Block then works with the trustee to sell off the property, and Crown and his family and other investors come out very well from the bankruptcy of the Rock Island. This is Judge Frank McGarr on the left, and William Gibbons and Nicholas Manos, his lawyer, who plays a strong role in the book as well, making the case for the trustee in the courtroom on the right, in front of one of the new bankruptcy blue Rock Island units, as it's called. And then there's John Ingram as president of the Rock Island. All right, biggest problems with reorganization: terrible weather. The inflated, historically bad winters in 78 and 79, blizzard conditions throughout the Midwest, Chicago, Iowa, elsewhere, terrible weather, which takes its toll on very poorly maintained track, ballast, and other things, as well as the spring floods that come with them. Interest rates were incredibly, well, inflation was the huge problem in the 70s, and I talk about this in the book. And by 1980, of course, Paul Volcker, who was appointed as chairman of the Fed by Jimmy Carter, drastically raises interest rates to try to deal with the inflated economy. This works, but it has a huge impact, a negative impact on major industries like railroad, steel, and other things. Because of increased prices for oil and gas due to the OPEC embargoes, due to the Iranian Revolution in 1978 and 79, there's diesel fuel shortages on the Rock Island. The Rock Island's kind of forced to pay cash in the barrelhead for its oil with Amoco twice in 1975 and again in 1980 or 1979. They're down to a 6-day supply by November of 79 due to the BRAC strike. So there's huge problems there. The record losses continue, $100 million in losses during that time. And then the BRAC strike and the United Transportation Union strike, which starts on August 28th of 1979. And I talk about this in the book. The Florida East Coast Railroad had broken its unions in the early 60s. And this was kind of, I'm sure, a railroad manager's dream to do just that. But when the BRAC strikes Norfolk and Western in 1978, that strike actually fails as the Norfolk and Western management run the trains. But Norfolk and Western in heavily rich coal territory helps them immensely. But when the BRAC strikes the Rock Island, it's over back pay. And Rock Island had always had pretty good labor relations with its major unions historically. And under Gibbons, it was no different. But what the unions were demanding were back retroactive pay on a contract. I think, I couldn't find this, Fred Kroll is the head of BRAC. He would die of leukemia a few years later at a young age, sadly. But Kroll, I think, was gambling on the fact that if they strike the railroad, as in bad of shape the railroad is, the government would bail them out. So they were, I think, were gambling on the fact that Penn Central's labor got bailed out by Conrail and the establishment of that, and the Rock Island workers would get bailed out as well. The Ingram and the management operate the trains about at a 30% rate, I believe, but the ICC orders directed service on the line by the Kansas City terminal in late 79. And in December of 79, finally, after 4 years of delay, and I was not able to ascertain what the delay was in submitting a plan of reorganization to the court, but Manos and Gibbons constantly asked for delays in this. They present a core proposal, which is unworkable. It would have kept mainly the main line from Chicago through Iowa to Council Bluffs, as well as the spine line, and it would have kept all the Iowa branch lines, but it would have been a reduced railroad that the profitability forecasts were just too great to consider, considering the dilapidation of the equipment and the property, as well as how many trains the Rock Island was even running when it was before bankruptcy. So it's rejected by the court after a study by Pearson, studies the plan, reports back to the court that the core proposal submitted is not possible to reorganize the property. And on January 28th of 1980, Judge McGarr recommends liquidation of the property, which is finalized by the end of March of 1980. Some improvements made under the court control, certainly acquisition of new motive power through lease arrangements, which of course all have to be paid under liquidation. They had started a rebuild program for the older Jeep 7s, and some of these were still running for the Chicago Northwestern well into the late 90s. Jumbo hopper cars, but jumbo hopper cars of 250,000 tons had a problem running on dilapidated branch lines. So the state of Iowa works with the shippers and states and the railroads to try to improve those. But slow orders are the biggest problem. About 5,000 miles of the line had 20 miles or less slow orders on them. And that was, of course, a huge problem in doing this. To speed up, in the book, I talk about the Penn Central. I talk about what the government tries to do here. My hero in the book is kind of Jimmy Carter, because he starts to push towards deregulation. And you get the Staggers Act passed after the Rock Island's bankruptcy, which frees the railroads from rate controls by the ICC, designed to speed up mergers and the process of track abandonments as well, because of the problems that Conrail had, as well as the Penn Central and the Midwestern bankrupts. Now, one other question I would have taken up more of, how come other railroads survive this regulatory environment? MOPAC does, and becomes an attractive property and merges with the Union Pacific in 1982. You have the Burlington Northern and Powder River Coal in the early 70s, which certainly helps its bottom line. The Southern Railroad's a classic example of a well-managed and prosperous role, but the growth of the Southeast in the 70s certainly helps that. And the Union Pacific has the most seamless transition from a railroad to a corporation with diversified interests and good management. So some railroads could prosper even under a regulatory environment. A lot of the railroads are fearful of staggers, because what does it mean to be under deregulation? You're almost used to the beast you have. And so this is something too that plays a role in people's thinkings. The territory, of course, matters most. The Rock Island went many places, but none of them well. Somebody always got there better and faster, maybe with the exception of the main Chicago and the spine line, but in a lot of other cases, as Roger said, it's a kind of a piecemeal constructed property. And then I talk about the liquidation, the settlement of that in the end as well. So I'll skip that just because we're running up against the hour, and some things are with us still. A lot of the property certainly is still in good shape. Southern Pacific buys the Golden State route, the Cotton Belt. It's in bad shape when they do it. There's a good YouTube video that shows the takeover of this by the Cotton Belt in Kansas. The bidding war for the spine line and the between Minneapolis and Kansas City is won by the Northwestern, but gets up to $100 million. So the trustee really acts as a sharp negotiator. Lots of Iowa branch lines are spun off to the short lines in the CNW, and eventually the Iowa Interstate is created to take over the Chicago to Omaha traffic. Metra, RTA, and then Metra buys the Rock Island, Maine, and Chicago to control its commuter service. But the Rock Island winds up coming out of liquidation in 1983 as the Chicago Pacific Corporation, with revenues and assets of $300 to $400 million, about most of it cash, after selling equipment and selling the property, and out of the railroad business entirely. And in 1986, the great irony is that that Chicago Pacific Corporation would be bought out by Maytag Corporation in Newton, Iowa, which ends the Rock Island story, but by a property that's on their own system, as it turns out. So I'm ready for questions.
Thanks, Greg. Let me bring the chat up here. I have a question. What was creative about the Rock Island destruction? And a thank you, Professor Schneider, and a great lecture.
What was creative about it?
Yes.
Not in an artistic way, it's not creative. Nothing creative. What Schumpeter is saying basically is that capitalism proceeds on, it's almost in a social Darwinist sense, on this idea that destruction of one company, asset, industry, usually replaced by another, is just the main developmental process of capitalism. And what Schumpeter argues in the end is what we'll get to is that capitalism will disappear and it will be replaced by corporatism, as he calls it, which I think has happened. You know, the relationship between companies and government has become much more close and much more tight, even since the time of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that I'm talking about. The creativity of it is not so much the creativity of one form of company replacing it. It's basically the companies that are marginal and cannot survive won't. I don't think that's creative. That's just the nature, as he's saying, of capitalism itself. Which, instead of think about what's going on when he's writing or thinking about this in the early 20th century, it's Marxism that's talking about capitalism will end. He borrows a lot from that. He agrees with Marx. Capitalism will come to an end, but it's not going to come to an end through bloody revolution. It's going to come through an end through the power of the market and the influence of new ideas and new kind of things on the market.
All right, we have a question from Bill. Did Brack's ineffective strike against the N&W factor into Kroll's decision to call a strike against the Rock Island? Oh,
go ahead. I'm sorry, Nick.
In other words, was Kroll willing to sacrifice the Rock Island to rebuild his standing within the union as a tough labor leader?
I could not find evidence of that. There is a book on the Norfolk and Western strike that was very helpful, by Bedingfield, I think was his name, about what the union was up to, and mainly it's about the management taking over the railroad and running it. I think I could not find evidence of why Kroll struck other than the back pay issue, the retroactive pay that they believed they were owed, that was not being paid by the Rock Island because of bankruptcy. My surmise is, and that's all it is, because Brack has papers, they're at Cornell University, and I did not look at them before the Rock Island book, because getting to Cornell is not easy, but I did look for them and look at some of them for my the next book project I'm working on, which is kind of stalled, but a bigger story of the railroad problem in the federal government in the early part of the century. Brack's papers didn't reveal anything to me about Kroll's purpose or rationale. My guess is it was designed to think that if the Rock Island died, or if we shut down the Rock Island in 1979, we're going to get a bailout from the federal government the way that the Penn Central and Conrail unions got bailed out by the government. And I have no evidence to back that up other than a supposition, I think.
We have a question from Owen. Were ownership at the Northwestern and the Milwaukee amenable to a merger with the Rock Island? So were they a tri-party merger?
I think Heinemann was doing this as part of the strategy to delay, and maybe to keep the issue of counter mergers alive. From what I understand, it was William Quinn, I think, was the head of Milwaukee at the time, and he thought he was going to have a merger with the Northwestern separately, and that never came to fruition either. So Quinn was waiting, I think, for Heinemann to kind of get back to him about merging the Northwestern now with the Chicago and Great Western with the Milwaukee, and that didn't come about either. I know that Richard Saunders talks about this in his great books on the merger movement in the 1960s, but from what I understand, no, he did not have any any support from the Milwaukee Road before proposing this. And the Rock Island rejected it because they were in a merger agreement with the Union Pacific. So Jervis Langdon wasn't interested in the prospect either.
Okay, the next one we have is one understudied aspect of the railroad crisis of the 1950s and 60s was the role of played by the industry's continued use of A and B accounting, which tended to depress asset valuation. Did this cause the Rock additional problems in raising money in those critical decades because its asset base was undervalued?
And I can't comment. I wish I was able to. Now my question is that something that was mandated by the ICC? Or was this just a practice that the railroads themselves had? And I don't know.
And I don't know that either. There's a professor who's been doing a lot of railroad accounting studies, and I can't remember his name. He just, oh, here we go. Yes, dating back to the Valuation Act of 1913. So it was apparently
So it was mandated.
Yeah.
So that's something they couldn't control even if they wanted to.
There was I think it might be Gary Previtz is an accounting historian who's might be able to be a person that could even.
You know, there was somebody working on the Valuation Act, and so maybe that's the same guy.
Yeah. Okay, it is. Okay, very good. I had a question that I was thinking of. When you did your research, was what made the property attractive to Henry Posner? And shame on me for not reading Roger's book yet, but you know, it's.
What was the question, Nick? About it was about Posner?
What made the husk of the Rock Island in Iowa attractive to Henry and his investment team? You know.
I think that, well, the kind of the birth of the Iowa interstates, and I talk about this, and it's been a while since I thought about it. I know they found there's something called the train, originally it's called TRAIN, and it's pushing to get by the Chicago to, I guess, to because CSX had taken control of the Chicago Blue Island to Bureau, Maine. So from Bureau to Council Bluffs, which was falling into disrepair because that segment had not been purchased yet. And I think finally the deal is finalized in 1983, I believe. And it's not the Iowa Interstate yet, but would soon after become the Iowa Interstate. And I know Roger could speak to this, having written on this topic much better than I could. But
yeah, if Roger wants to say, read the book, Nick, we have it at the library. I just don't have time to read the books right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is complicated. It's a great story, and there was the Iowa Railroad that was mismanaged, and there were a host of problems. And Henry got involved in it after the Iowa Interstate was created, and there was a big fight in the early part of this, this century, between ADM that had a real interest and Henry. But Henry is a sharp cookie, and he had a lot of good advice, and he pulled it off. And then, as he said, it's better to be lucky than to be good, because then the ethanol business picked up, and that was an incredible financial shot in the arm for the Iowa Interstate. And also, he had good management. He knows what he's doing. He has a love for railroads. The guy's brilliant, and the Iowa Interstate reflects that.
Yeah, it's always fun to hear Henry give a talk at a conference. He's very sharp cookie.
I've talked to Henry quite a bit since the book. So again, I didn't want to do interviews, probably should have. Dan Sabin would have been nice to talk to as well, and others, but mostly I just wanted to avoid the kind of grief I got with the Young Americans for Freedom. You didn't say this right, and I knew better than you did, and you didn't tell me that, or you wouldn't interview me. That was in a day before even the internet, so on the cusp of the internet, so I couldn't even email people.
Yeah. We have gotten Bill Dixon's collection at the Mercantile. Unfortunately, what we are getting, it's had to come in stages, and I think his papers are going to be the last part.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting to hear from Bill's daughter the disappointment about the demise of the Rock Island, and how he and Jervis really were hoping they could really make a go of it out there. And they were probably two of the smartest guys that were at B&O CNO from industrial engineering.
Yeah. I think ultimately the problems were just too immense, even by the time they take it over. I mean, if the UP wasn't willing to spend much money on its merger partner, because of the amounts then kept rising, and the amount of expenses the UP would have to pay. So by 1974, I think it had risen to $300 million or $400 million that they'd have to pump into the Rock Island to rehabilitate it. And of course, they decide to withdraw from the merger agreement after it's approved by the ICC, which is no surprise.
Yeah.
By that time, Kennefic and Provo had been, exchanging trains at Fremont, and the UP was basically in that relationship with the CNW, which had gained, again, FRA money to rebuild its main line through Illinois. So the Rock Island couldn't secure that money, but the Chicago Northwestern didn't.
Yeah.
Or did, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do a last call for questions, and then I think we're probably going to wrap it up. Greg and Roger's books are all still available. They're all in print. Greg just pointed out that the Rock Island Requiem is in paperback now. And yours is through Oklahoma?
Kansas Press.
Kansas Press. Yeah.
Press.
Okay. And a lot of Rogers are coming out of Indiana University Press. Both fine houses for railroads. I want to thank everyone, Gary, or Greg and Roger. Thank you both for giving us part of your weekend to join us.
It's been fun. I've learned a lot.
I know, me too.
And Steve, thank you so much for the tour of Bureau. It was great to see the Barriger collection photos used in this way, because the prototype modelers, that's a group that I'm glad we're able to help. As a hobbyist who unfortunately is living in an apartment right now and can't have a railroad, I live vicariously through the model railroading community. So Steve, thank you for that. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. And thank you for the great questions. We are going to have this online, hopefully, depends on how long Zoom takes to process the video, hopefully tomorrow. If not, we'll try and get it online by Monday. And our next session is going to be in July. It's going to be on 19th century railroading. So watch the Facebook page for the Mercantile Library, and I'll put things up on the RNLHS group and other web spaces for anyone who's interested. And if you do want to ask a question after the fact, you can email me, you can email Roger, Greg, or Steve directly. And we're happy to take care of any questions you may have later on. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend. And hopefully we'll see you in July at our next session, or come by and visit us. We're open again at the university. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Appreciate it.
Bye.